8 o'clock hours, March 4th, 1945. Iwo Jima. A greasy dawn breaks over the black volcanic ash, the air thick with the metallic tang of cordite and the sweet cloying smell of death. On the southern plateau, below the ominous silhouette of Mount Suribachi, the landscape is a monochrome nightmare, a vision of churned earth and skeletal, shattered rock. Smoke, white and gray, drifts from burning Japanese positions, still holding out in the island's northern crags, a persistent reminder that this battle is far from over. This is D+13. 13 days since the first wave of United States Marines hit these shores, and the fighting still rages with a ferocity that has shocked even the most hardened combat veterans. For Sergeant Hank Thompson of the 5th Marine Division, crouched in a shell scrape near Motoyama Airfield No. 1, the island is a series of overlapping fields of fire, a place where every yard gained is measured in casualties. The ground beneath him is not soil, but a coarse, abrasive powder, littered with the detritus of a titanic struggle. Spent shell casings, twisted shards of shrapnel, discarded ration tins, and the silent forms of the fallen from both sides. The airfield itself is a ruin. Its single runway, once a prized strategic asset for the Japanese, is now a pockmarked wasteland, cratered by thousands of pounds of naval gunfire and aerial bombs. Concrete revetments are shattered into rubble. Hangars are twisted skeletons of scorched steel. The surface is a chaotic mess of overlapping blast holes, some of them 30 feet wide and 10 feet deep, easily large enough to swallow a jeep. The immediate stakes for men like Thompson are survival, but for the larger war effort, the stakes are centered on this very ruin. The V Marine Amphibious Corps is here to seize this 8-square-mile piece of rock, not for its own sake, but for the airfields that lie broken upon it. The survival of thousands of other Americans, men flying missions hundreds of miles to the north, depends entirely on what happens here next. And what happens next is not another wave of infantry. It is something else entirely. It is the sound of diesel engines, a low, guttural growl that begins to rise above the sporadic crackle of rifle fire. On the beaches below, a new kind of invasion is beginning. These are the men of the United States Navy's Construction Battalions, the Seabees. They have come to build not on a secure island, but in the middle of a killing ground. The fight for Iwo Jima is about to enter a new, astonishing phase. The United States Navy Construction Battalions, the Seabees, were a unique creation of the Second World War, a direct answer to the strategic problem of projecting power across the vast Pacific. Before their formation in late 1941, construction work in forward areas was handled by civilian contractors. The attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent capture of civilian builders on Wake Island, who were unable to legally bear arms to defend themselves, made it brutally clear that a new solution was required. The Navy needed men who could build and fight. The motto they adopted was simple and direct: construimus, batuimus. We build, we fight. The men who filled their ranks were not typical military recruits. They were older, with an average age of 37, a full decade older than the average Marine infantryman. They were recruited directly from the civilian construction trades: heavy equipment operators, electricians, carpenters, draftsmen, mechanics. They were masters of their crafts, men who knew how to erect a skyscraper or pave a highway, and the Navy gave them bulldozers, cranes, and rifles, then sent them to the front lines. Their reputation for speed and ingenuity had become legendary across the Pacific theater. On Guadalcanal, they had repaired the critical Henderson Field while under constant Japanese air and artillery attack. On Bougainville, they had built 3 airfields in dense jungle, draining a swamp that engineers had declared unusable. They saw regulations as suggestions and improvisation as doctrine. Their unofficial slogan, "Can do," reflected a culture of aggressive problem-solving. If they lacked a specific part, they would fabricate one. If a plan was unworkable, they would devise a new one on the spot. This ethos was precisely why they were dispatched to Iwo Jima with such urgency, landing just behind the assault waves of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions. Standard military doctrine called for an area to be fully secured before major construction began. Iwo Jima would shatter that doctrine. The island was too important, the need too great to wait. The men of the 31st, 62nd, and 91st Naval Construction Battalions were not a follow-on force. They were an integral part of the assault, tasked with turning a battlefield into a forward airbase while the battle for it was still being fought, a mission profile that bordered on the suicidal. They would work under fire, sleep in foxholes, and run their bulldozers within sight of enemy positions. Their fight was not just against the determined Japanese defenders, but against the island itself, a hostile landscape of soft ash and unforgiving rock that would test their skills and their machines to the absolute limit. The strategic importance of Iwo Jima could not be overstated. It was a matter of grim arithmetic, a calculation written in fuel, altitude, and human lives. By early 1945, the United States Army Air Force's 21st Bomber Command, operating from newly captured bases in the Mariana Islands, Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, was executing the final phase of the air war against Japan. The centerpiece of this campaign was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of the war. It was a technological marvel, a pressurized, high-altitude strategic weapon capable of carrying a 10-ton bomb load over 3,000 miles. But the journey from the Marianas to the industrial heart of Japan and back was a grueling 3,000 nautical mile round trip, a mission that pushed the B-29s and their crews to the very edge of their operational endurance. For 15 hours, they were in the air, much of it over open ocean. Any mechanical failure, any significant battle damage could be a death sentence. A feathered engine from flak over Tokyo, or a fuel leak from a fighter's cannon shell meant the bomber would likely not have the range to make it home. The crew would face the horrific choice of ditching in the freezing North Pacific or attempting to bail out over enemy territory. Iwo Jima sat almost exactly halfway along this perilous flight path, a tiny 8-square-mile speck of salvation. In American hands, its airfields would become an indispensable emergency landing strip, a place where crippled bombers could put down, refuel, and receive essential repairs. Beyond its role as a rescue base, the island was also critical for offensive operations. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima were harassing the B-29 formations, forcing them to fly dog-leg routes that consumed precious fuel. Taking the island would eliminate this threat and, more importantly, provide a base for American P-51 Mustang fighters. These long-range escorts could then accompany the bombers all the way to Japan, protecting them from the swarms of interceptors defending the home islands. General Curtis LeMay, commander of 21st Bomber Command, understood the calculus perfectly. Every B-29 cost over $600,000, the equivalent of more than $9 million today. Each carried a highly trained crew of 11 men. The losses on the long-range missions were becoming unsustainable. The island had to be taken, and its airfields had to be made operational, not in months or even weeks, but in days. The pressure fell squarely on the Seabees. Their work would directly determine whether hundreds of B-29s and their 11-man crews would survive the coming months. The lifeline to the Marianas had to be anchored at Iwo Jima, and it had to be done now. The first bulldozers of the 31st Naval Construction Battalion came ashore on D+2, February 21, 1945. They did not arrive in a quiet, secured rear area. They landed on yellow and blue beaches, strips of black sand still swept by Japanese mortar and machine gun fire from emplacements in the high ground to the north. The initial landings were chaotic. LSTS, landing ship, tank, nosed onto the steep terraced beaches, dropping their ramps into the churning surf. Down these ramps rumbled the machines of reconstruction, Caterpillar D8 bulldozers, massive yellow behemoths weighing nearly 20 tons, motorized graders for leveling earth, and heavy-duty cranes for lifting wreckage. The beach was a scrapyard of knocked-out landing craft, burning Amtraks and bogged-down trucks. The soft volcanic ash that formed the island's surface was a logistical nightmare. It had no cohesion, no load-bearing capacity. Heavy vehicles immediately sank up to their axles, their tracks spinning uselessly. The Seabees had anticipated this. They laid down heavy steel matting to create temporary roadways from the water's edge, a slow, laborious process conducted under the constant threat of enemy fire. From his vantage point, Equipment Operator Third Class Chet Bigelow of the 62nd NCB watched as a mortar round landed just 50 yards from his D8 as he maneuvered it off the LST ramp. The explosion sent a geyser of black ash into the air, and he could feel the shrapnel pinging off his machine's heavy steel blade. There was no time to dig in, no time to wait for the Marines to clear every sniper's nest. The mission was to get the equipment to Motoyama Airfield No. 1, less than a mile inland, and start work. Progress was agonizingly slow. Each piece of heavy equipment had to be dragged or winched across the softest sections of the beach. Bulldozers became prime movers, towing other vehicles and artillery pieces through the choking ash. The noise was deafening, a symphony of roaring diesel engines, shouting men, and the percussive blasts of incoming shells. The Seabees worked with a grim, focused determination. They were acutely aware that their Marine counterparts were still fighting and dying just hundreds of yards away, securing the very ground they needed to work on. It was a surreal environment where the tools of construction and the weapons of war operated side by side. A bulldozer blade, designed to move earth, was raised to shield its operator from small arms fire. A crane, meant for lifting steel beams, was used to haul a disabled Sherman tank out of a shell crater. This immediate frontline engineering was the embodiment of the Seabee spirit. They were not waiting for the battle to end. They were joining it, armed with wrenches and welding torches, determined to turn a hellscape into a runway before the last shot was even fired. Their arrival signaled a fundamental shift in the battle, from pure destruction to desperate, urgent creation. The primary obstacle confronting the Seabees on Iwo Jima was the island itself. The geology of the place seemed engineered for maximum difficulty. The surface was a deep layer of volcanic ash, a granular material with the consistency of coarse sand. It was light, easily displaced, and offered almost no traction. For heavy construction equipment, it was a treacherous trap. The massive Caterpillar D8 bulldozers, the workhorses of the fleet, would frequently sink into the soft ground, their powerful engines straining as their tracks churned the ash into a fine, black dust that got into everything. It clogged air filters, abraded engine components, and wore down moving parts at an astonishing rate. Post-war analysis would show that equipment life expectancy on Iwo Jima was reduced by nearly 70% compared to operations on coral atolls. The mechanics of the construction battalions worked around the clock in makeshift open-air workshops, cannibalizing wrecked machines for spare parts just to keep the active fleet of bulldozers, graders, and rollers operational. Beyond the ash, the terrain was a testament to the sheer violence of the pre-invasion bombardment. Motoyama Airfield No. 1 was not just damaged, it was systematically obliterated. The runway was a lunar landscape of interlocking craters from 16-inch naval shells and 500-pound bombs. These were not simple holes to be filled. The blasts had pulverized the underlying rock and compacted the ash in unpredictable ways, creating a patchwork of unstable ground. Clearing the wreckage was another colossal task. The field was littered with the skeletons of Japanese aircraft. Mitsubishi A6 M0s and Nakajima Ki 43 Oscars, their aluminum skins torn and blackened. Concrete pillboxes, shattered by direct hits, had to be broken up and hauled away. Unexploded ordnance was a constant menace. Seabee operators, pushing tons of earth with their bulldozer blades, never knew if they were about to strike a live bomb or an artillery shell buried just beneath the surface. Several bulldozers were lost this way, their operators killed instantly in thunderous explosions that served as stark reminders of the ever-present danger. Space was also a critical constraint. The island was small, and the area around the airfield was crowded with Marine command posts, artillery batteries, and supply dumps. The Seabees had to maneuver their massive equipment in a congested, hazardous environment, all while Japanese artillery from the northern part of the island continued to rain down shells with sporadic, unpredictable accuracy. The Japanese defenders, entrenched in a labyrinth of caves and tunnels, had a direct line of sight to the construction activity. They knew exactly what the Americans were doing and why, and they did everything in their power to stop it. The process of transforming the cratered moonscape of Motoyama No. 1 into a functional airstrip was a brutal, relentless exercise in heavy engineering under combat conditions. The Seabees worked in 12-hour shifts, 24 hours a day, under the harsh glare of portable floodlights at night, which made them perfect targets for Japanese gunners. The first step was the most basic, filling the craters. A fleet of bulldozers, operating in coordinated echelons, began to push the loose volcanic ash from the crater rims back into the voids. It was like trying to build a sand castle with dry sand. The loose material would not compact. Engineers quickly realized that simply filling the holes was insufficient. The ground had no stability. The solution was salt water. Pumps were set up on the beaches, feeding long hoses that sprayed seawater onto the ash. The water gave the material just enough cohesion to be compacted by heavy sheep's foot rollers, their studded drums pounding the unstable ground into a semi-solid foundation. As one team filled craters, another tackled the wreckage. Cranes lifted the shattered remains of Japanese aircraft onto flatbed trucks. Bulldozers fitted with heavy ripper teeth tore into the foundations of destroyed buildings, breaking up the concrete so it could be scooped up and hauled away. While this frantic work continued, the centerpiece of the operation began to arrive at the beaches, thousands of tons of Marston matting. This was pierced steel planking, or PSP, one of the great unsung innovations of the war. Each plank was a 10-foot-long, 15-inch-wide strip of stamped steel, perforated with holes to reduce weight and aid drainage. The edges were lined with a simple, effective hook and slot system, allowing the planks to be interlocked by hand. A small crew of men, working with hammers, could lay down a solid, all-weather runway surface with astonishing speed. Squads of Seabees, working in long lines, began laying the matting. It was heavy, back-breaking labor. Each plank weighed over 60 pounds. The men would heave them into place, lock them together, and move to the next, creating a growing carpet of steel over the stabilized ash. The rhythmic clang of hammers on steel became the new soundtrack of Iwo Jima's southern plateau, a sound of creation that slowly began to drown out the sounds of destruction. The men worked with a desperate urgency, knowing that every hour saved could mean another B-29 crew saved. They repaired their own equipment, graded their own roads, and defended their own positions, a self-contained universe of construction and combat. The speed of their progress was simply unbelievable. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the brilliant and determined commander of the Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima, had based his entire defensive strategy on a war of attrition. He knew he could not prevent the Americans from landing, but he believed he could make them pay such a horrific price in blood that their will to fight would break. His plan involved a deep, interlocking defense of tunnels, caves, and fortified blockhouses designed to bleed the Marine divisions dry. He had anticipated that the Americans would need the airfields and had sited many of his artillery and mortar positions to cover them. Kuribayashi's planning assumed a conventional timeline. Post-war studies of Japanese military doctrine suggest that their engineers estimated it would take the Americans weeks, if not months, to repair the systematically destroyed runways. They believed the constant artillery harassment combined with the impossible terrain would indefinitely delay any major flight operations. This assumption proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. From their observation posts on the high ground in the north, Japanese officers watched in disbelief as the scene on Motoyama No. 1 unfolded. Where they expected to see small teams of surveyors and engineers gingerly clearing mines, they saw a swarm of giant yellow machines moving with relentless purpose. The sheer scale and speed of the American industrial effort were beyond their comprehension. Reports from Japanese artillery spotters grew increasingly frantic. They would call in fire missions on the airfield, and a salvo of 150mm shells would crash down among the bulldozers. The Seabees would dive for cover, but moments after the explosions, the diesel engines would roar back to life, and the machines would move back to work, sometimes pushing the debris from the new shell craters as they went. This resilience was profoundly demoralizing. The Americans did not just have more equipment, they had a methodology, a system of repair and reconstruction that seemed to operate at an inhuman pace. The Japanese resistance continued. Snipers took potshots at equipment operators. Mortar teams fired harassing barrages throughout the day and night, inflicting a steady stream of casualties on the construction crews. On March 2nd, a Japanese shell struck a Seabee supply dump near the airfield, causing a massive explosion of fuel and ammunition that killed and wounded several men. But it never stopped the work. The Seabees filled the new craters, buried their dead, and kept laying the steel matting. By March 3rd, less than 48 hours after the main construction effort had begun, a continuous strip of steel matting over 2,000 feet long was in place. For the Japanese soldiers huddled in their tunnels, the sound of the B-29 engines they would soon hear would be the sound of their strategic assumptions collapsing. The first test of the Seabees' frantic labor came on the afternoon of March 4th, 1945. High over the Pacific, 600 miles northwest of Iwo Jima, the pilot of a B-29 superfortress named Dynamite was fighting to keep his aircraft in the air. First Lieutenant Fred Malo and his 10-man crew were returning from a raid on the Nakajima aircraft engine factory near Tokyo. The mission had been costly. Flak and Japanese fighters had riddled their bomber. Two of their four Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines were damaged and running rough. A third was leaking fuel at an alarming rate. Most critically, their bomb bay doors were stuck open, creating massive drag that chewed through their remaining fuel supply. Malo ran the numbers. They were too heavy with fuel to make it all the way back to their base on Tinian, another 650 miles to the south. The fuel gauges were dropping precipitously. Ditching in the cold Pacific was their only other option, a choice with a grimly low probability of survival. But there was a third, desperate possibility. Over the radio, Malo received the astonishing news. A rudimentary airstrip on Iwo Jima was accepting emergency landings. The island was still a battlefield. Heavy fighting was still raging in the north. The airstrip was short, unfinished, and under occasional mortar fire. But for the crew of Dynamite, it was the only hope they had. On the ground at Motoyama No. 1, the Seabees of the 62nd NCB received the word, a superfortress was inbound. They cleared the runway of all equipment, while Marines from the 3rd Division established a security perimeter. Everyone watched the sky to the north. Soon they spotted it, a silver giant limping toward them, its bomb bay doors gaping open like a wound. Lieutenant Malo lined up his approach, flying over the northern end of the island where the fighting was still intense. He could see muzzle flashes from both sides on the ground below. He feathered his failing engines and brought the 65-ton bomber in. The landing was rough. The B-29 hit the steel matting hard, bounced once, and finally settled, its massive tires rolling down the freshly laid runway. It came to a stop with less than 100 feet of runway to spare, its engines sputtering to a stop. A stunned silence fell over the airfield, broken moments later by a wave of cheers from the Seabees and Marines who had witnessed the landing. The mission of Iwo Jima had just been validated in the most dramatic way possible. Dynamite was the first, but she would not be the last. Over the next few hours, several more battle-damaged B-29s followed her in, their crews exhausted and grateful. The Seabees had built a lifeline, and it was already saving lives. The sight of these behemoths, the very symbols of American air power, landing on a runway that had been a shattered ruin only days before, was a powerful message to everyone on the island, American and Japanese alike. The strategic turning point had arrived. The successful emergency landings on March 4th were just the beginning. The trickle of crippled B-29s soon became a steady stream. By the end of March, with the island finally declared secure, the Seabees had completed a much longer 5,200-foot primary runway on Motoyama Field No. 1, designated for bomber use. They had also repaired and extended the 2 other existing Japanese fields, turning Iwo Jima into a sprawling multi-runway airbase. The impact on the strategic air war against Japan was immediate and profound. By the war's end, a total of 2,251 B-29 superfortresses would make emergency landings on the island. A staggering 24,761 airmen, the crews of those bombers, owed their lives to the existence of those runways. That is a number larger than the total number of American casualties suffered in taking the island in the first place, a stark and powerful justification for the brutal battle. The island quickly transitioned from an emergency field to an offensive hub. On March 7th, just 11 days after the initial landings, the first P-51 Mustangs of the 15th Fighter Group arrived. By April, Iwo Jima was home to 3 full fighter groups. These Mustangs began escorting the B-29s on their raids over Japan, a mission that had been impossible from the Marianas. The presence of the fighters dramatically altered the air combat equation. They engaged Japanese interceptors, clearing a path for the bombers and significantly reducing B-29 losses. American bomber losses per sortie dropped by over 25% in the months following the introduction of Iwo Jima-based escorts. The base also allowed for a shift in bombing tactics. General LeMay initiated his infamous low-level incendiary raids on Japanese cities, missions that were far more dangerous for the crews but devastatingly effective. The psychological reassurance of having a safe haven on the return journey cannot be quantified, but after-action reports from bomber crews consistently cited the Iwo Jima checkpoint as a critical morale booster. It transformed a mission with no margin for error into one with a chance of recovery. The air war had been a relentless, grinding campaign of attrition. The Seabees' work on Iwo Jima fundamentally changed the math of that attrition, tilting it decisively in favor of the Allied forces and accelerating the final collapse of the Japanese war machine. The achievement of the Navy Construction Battalions on Iwo Jima became an enduring legend, a defining moment that perfectly encapsulated their can-do spirit. They had not just built an airfield, they had built it faster than anyone thought possible, under conditions that conventional military engineering doctrine would have deemed unworkable. They had landed with the assault troops, operated under enemy fire, and overcome a uniquely hostile environment through sheer ingenuity and relentless effort. Their work demonstrated a new paradigm of expeditionary engineering, where construction was not a follow-on support activity, but a frontline combat capability. This principle would shape United States military logistics and forward-basing strategy for decades to come, proving essential in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The speed with which they turned a blasted piece of volcanic rock into a vital strategic asset sent a shockwave through the Japanese high command, a clear and undeniable signal of the overwhelming industrial might and logistical prowess they were facing. It was a tangible demonstration that America could not only destroy, but it could create and build on a scale and at a speed that was simply impossible to counter. Iwo Jima was secured at a terrible cost, with over 6,800 Marines and sailors killed and another 19,000 wounded. The Seabees themselves suffered casualties, a testament to the dangers of their frontline work. Yet, the 2,251 B-29s that landed there, carrying 24,761 crewmen, stand as a permanent monument to their labor. The runways they carved from the black ash were more than just infrastructure. They were a lifeline, a sanctuary, and ultimately a critical weapon that shortened the Pacific War.